Hello, I'm Emma Watkins. I'm a lecturer in criminology at the University of Birmingham. My research specialty is historical criminology, and I've started a new project which is funded by the AHRC, which looks at 19th century institutions known as reformatory schools. The purpose of this project is to look at the institutions as a whole, but also focus on the use of corporal punishment within those institutions, which held offending children. Industrial and reformatory schools were established in the mid-19th century and lasted until 1933. They were part of the criminal justice system, but they were overseen as well by the Home Office. The Home Office used to use inspectors to both certify the institutions, but also to inspect them on an annual basis and write reports on each institution. So while they were overseen by the state, they were usually, in fact overwhelmingly, private or church-run organizations. So overseen by the state, but not run by the state. And while industrial schools and reformatory schools have different names, the purpose of both of these schools was relatively the same thing. So both were there to reform offending juveniles or at-risk juveniles. And the idea was that, or what they were premised on, was that children were malleable, they were reformable, they could be educated so that they could become useful working citizens again, to be useful to society. In terms of who these institutions were for, there's the easy answer and the more complex, nuanced answer. So to begin with, there's the technical answer, if you will. So the Young Offenders Act of 1854 gave the authority to the courts to send children who were under the age of 16 to reformatory schools if they'd been convicted of an imprisonable offence. A further act was brought in 1857, which meant that children who were at risk or neglected could be sent to industrial schools. So they hadn't committed an offence, but they were at risk of committing an offence or of being in danger themselves. So that's the technical answer. That gives us the demographics, if you will. But the more complex answer is that not every child that fitted that demographic was equally vulnerable to end up in these institutions. There was socioeconomic bias at play, which meant that those who were from the lower social economic classes, working classes, were the ones who were targeted for these institutions. The graph you can see in front of you now shows the number of boys and girls who were admitted to the reformatory schools in England over time. And as you can see, there's considerably more boys than girls who ended up in these reformatory schools. I touched on just now the socioeconomic class bias that was at play with these reformatories, but of course gender came into play as well. There's not a simple answer to the disproportion that you're seeing within the graph here, but we can certainly say that then, and to a lesser extent now, girls were subject to an increased informal control, which meant that they were more likely to be controlled within the private sphere of the home and to have less freedom to wander the public streets than boys of the same age, making them less vulnerable to formal social controls through the courts, and so therefore less likely to end up in the reformatory or industrial schools. And we're seeing a bit of that within this graph. This graph shows the number of children under detention at both reformatory schools and industrial schools. The industrial schools includes truant schools as well. And what you can see here is that there were far more children sent to industrial schools than reformatory schools. In fact, the reformatory schools was very stable population. The reason for this lies in the criteria for admittance. As touched on earlier, reformatory schools targeted those who had committed offences to help criminal children. Industrial schools targeted those who were vagrant, neglected, or otherwise at risk. However, the daily life of children who ended up in either a reformatory or an industrial school was actually very similar. The same kind of routine and discipline and punishments happened in both institutions. But what made the number of children in reformatory schools relatively stable, but the industrial school children's increase over time, is the much wider criteria, the bigger net, if you will, that was thrown for industrial school children. Because any child who was seen to be neglected, at home alone, out in the public streets, could be subject to being sent to an industrial school, whereas reformatory schools, they had to be convicted in a court of law. This idea of a separate criminal justice system for children might give you the impression that after reformatories and industrial schools were established, children no longer were sent to prisons that were designed for adults. But this was not actually the case. Firstly, children could just be sent to prison rather than being diverted to the reformatory system. Secondly, it was explicitly written in the acts which established these institutions that children had to spend 14 days in prison before they were transferred to the reformatory system. Now, there were two schools of thought on this, which were hotly debated. One was that these 14 days in prison were really needed in order to give these children a sharp shock so that they would really appreciate the reformatory system when they ended up there. The other school of thought was that by sending children to prison for 2 weeks before they went to the reformatory system, this was really negating the whole point of the reformatory system, which was to establish a separate criminal justice system for children. Eventually, though, in 1899, the practice of sending children to prison before they were sent to the reformatory system was forbade. The Young Persons Act of 1932 saw the end of the industrial and reformatory schools. Instead of children being sent to separate institutions dependent on whether they had committed a criminal offence or if they were at risk, they were now sent to the same institutions, the approved school. This was partly due to a need for rebranding because the reformatory and industrial schools had a series of scandals and there was public waning of support for these institutions, but also due to this long-standing debate where children were no longer seen to be responsible for their criminal behaviour. Other factors outside of the children, such as their parents, their circumstances, were looked to for reasons behind their offending. And because of this, it didn't seem to make sense anymore to those philanthropists, politicians who were fighting for change within the criminal justice system. It didn't seem sense to them anymore to separate these children. And so now they were all sent to approved schools. The aim of this project is to look at how offending children were dealt with within the reformatory system itself. I'll be focusing on the use of corporal punishment within male and female reformatory schools. I want to do this as well at different levels. So I'll look at the institution itself, so looking at regional institutions. I will also be looking at it at a political level, so looking at parliamentary debates, the Home Office inspectors' reports, for example, and look at their narrative of justification in terms of the use of corporal punishment. And then I will also be looking at the public level, what were the public aware of in terms of the use of corporal punishment within these institutions. So I'll be turning to newspapers to do that. Keep an eye out for the next video, which will be a case study of a particular reformatory school. I've chosen a female reformatory school, that of Devon and Exeter Girls Reformatory School, where I'll be looking at the offending of the girls within the institution itself and the punishments that they received. Thank you very much for listening.